So good morning, everyone. My name is Vanessa Mendoza, and I'm the Executive Vice President at the Manhattan Institute. And I'm so very pleased to be introducing our next speaker, John Crowley. Last year, I had the great opportunity to spend some time with John. It was under the auspices of the Manhattan Institute's Project FDA. It's a project where we're looking very closely at the FDA, and we're thinking about biotechnical innovation. And this meeting was very important, and we had lots of very important things to talk about, but within 10 minutes, all I kept thinking is, I just can't leave without telling John about the Adam Smith Society. And the reason is because he's exactly the kind of business person that we are seeking to support through this project. I'll pick up on a point that Marilyn made earlier this morning, which is that making sure that the roads to opportunity are clear for all Americans is absolutely a critical part of what the Manhattan Institute does. But there are those among us who create that opportunity for themselves. They see a glimmer of an idea, or they have a need, like John, that propels them to make their own reality. Many of the most incredible things we use, in fact, some of the things that don't seem so incredible today, but maybe 20 years ago might have seemed like magic, all started with that glimmer of an idea. And it's our position at the Manhattan Institute that those people who take that idea and make it into a reality should be celebrated. And with that in mind, John is so very much deserving. John's life story and his work as a business person are so intricately woven together, so I won't preempt his talk too much by going too deeply into his bio, but I will say that he is the president and CEO of Amicus Therapeutics. It's a position he's held for almost 10 years. He has a JD from the University of Notre Dame and an MBA from Harvard Business School. He attended the U.S. Naval Academy and still serves in their reserve as an intelligence officer. Now, many people know John's story because he's been profiled for, I guess, at least the past 10 years in the Wall Street Journal by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Geeta Anand. Geeta, after I think the first profile, wrote a book that was published in 2006 about John Crowley, his family, his life, and his business. Shortly thereafter, it was co-opted by Harrison Ford and Double Feature Films. In 2010, the movie Extraordinary Measures was released nationwide. And because sometimes pictures are better than words, I'm really happy to bring to you today the trailer for Extraordinary Measures.
In both kids, it's heart that's the real threat to their lives.
How much more time do we have?
Megan, maybe a year. Patrick, less.
I wish that we had a drug to treat Pompeii, but we simply don't. I'm sorry.
Dr. Stonehill.
Yeah.
This is John Crowley. All the researchers out there say that you're a genius on the verge of a scientific breakthrough.
I'm not on the verge of anything.
How much would it take to prove your theory?
The odds against you are crushing. But where does that leave your kids when the dad has no job and no health insurance?
You're right. This is crazy.
But I can't just sit around and wait for my kids to die. I promised him that we'd raise 500.
That's all?
1,000.
Is it 500 or 1,000?
500,000.
Are you totally insane?
Apparently.
Is he worth it? A Stonehill guy?
He's really eccentric, but his science is way ahead of everybody else's.
Do you have a wife?
Ex-wives. 2 of them.
Yeah? How come?
Because I'm so easy to get along with. Figure any dude in a business suit can help me raise venture capital and run the company. But who's going to be half as motivated as a dad who's trying to save his own kids?
When my dreams are over and my feet...
We can do this. We push ourselves. We work around the clock.
I already work around the clock!
Great. Cure diseases in theory, but never help a single human being in reality.
Can't cure your kids, you know that, but I think I can save their lives.
What if he succeeds too late? Then what?
You're in clinical trials by the end of the year, or we pull the plug.
Nobody is gonna tell me how to run my lab.
We're out of time.
Are you crazy? You've jeopardized your chances of ever getting your kids treated.
We are alive. We are strong.
Do you remember you told me that I should stop chasing miracles?
Well, don't get your hopes up, kid. It's a Hail Mary.
Not gonna kiss me, is he?
Please join me in welcoming John Crowley.
Hi, thank you, Vanessa, for the introduction, and good morning, everybody. And for those of you from out of town, welcome to New York. We live across the river in New Jersey, so it's always nice to have people back east. I speak to you wearing two hats this morning. I wear one as the dad of 3 and children, 2 with very special needs, Megan and Patrick, who live with Pompe disease, a neuromuscular disease that when they were first diagnosed in 1998 at age 15 months and 7 days old, we were told there was nothing that could be done, and there was no treatment, and there was no cure. And I'll always wear that hat of a dad. But through that journey and in trying to discover research and scientists, and I was 1 year out of my MBA program when the kids were diagnosed, it led me to wear a second hat, and that of an entrepreneur, and to try to use the skills that I had through business. And I wasn't a scientist, I wasn't a doctor, but to try to use a little of what I knew to try to solve a very important problem, a problem that affected our family and thousands of people who live and their children, and with the adults who live with an adult form of this very rare and fatal neuromuscular disease. And with that, we launched into the whole world of medicine and drug development, and it was a very steep learning curve. And very quickly, I came to realize that there were a lot of parts of what I'll call this virtuous circle that really enables and sustains our ability to research, develop, and eventually to commercialize medicines for people in need, to extend and enhance life by developing life-saving medicines. And if you think about that virtuous circle and what it took, and I'm not going to go too deep into our family's personal journey. I will tell you that Megan is the kids we were originally told would only live to be a couple of years old. And as portrayed in the film, we did develop a medicine starting in a very small company with a handful of us and $37,000 in seed capital that led to building a business that we sold to a larger biotech that by 2003 led to Megan and Patrick and other children living with Pompe disease to begin to receive this life-saving medicine, which they still take today. And that began our journey into the world of Pompe, and with this company, this next business that we've been a part of with Amicus Therapeutics, now almost a decade into this, to be able to continue to drive innovation and ideas and science as far and as fast as we possibly can. But one thing I've learned in the last 15 plus years of this journey is that it really does take every element of this virtuous circle. It takes academic research, and that is one of our huge strategic advantages in this country, is our great universities and the depth of our research that leads to such cutting-edge innovations, and in my business, ultimately medicines. So universities play a part, the NIH plays a role, regulators play a role, all of those people, and then really important parts come into play to continue to drive that science out of universities and into business. It takes angel investors. My first money that I ever raised was from 37 individuals. We raised $1.2 million, really our seed money in that first company, Novozyme. And from there, we eventually reached out to the venture capital community, people who took what was little more than an idea that had some real early proof of concept in mice genetically engineered to have this Pompe disease, that we may be able to come up with a treatment. But even then, if successful, it would be a long road and it would take a lot more money. So you go from the academics through the government work and working with regulators to develop a framework for how you drive this medicine forward, to entrepreneurs, to investors, to venture capitalists, eventually to larger companies when we sold Novozyme and I became part of a much larger biotech company, Genzyme Therapeutics, in developing that medicine. It takes patients and families, patient advocacy groups, building awareness, finding others who live with similar disorders, all part of that virtuous circle. And again, you could read in Gita's book or watch the movie and learn more about our family's journey, and it was not always an easy one. When the movie came out 4 years ago, we had the chance to travel the country and to go to different parts of the world as the movie premiered and to talk about the film and some of the life messages there. And, you know, it is Hollywood, and in a very entertaining fashion, I think. They told the story of what was 5 years of our life, condensed down to an 18-month time frame, told over a 2-hour movie. And one of the many media that we got to meet was an Italian reporter, and I'm half Irish, half Italian by heritage, so it's kind of an honor talking to folks and a little bit about what it meant growing up with Italian grandparents, and that was a terrific part of the story and part of the family. But she asked me a question. She said, could this, in a beautiful accent, she said, could this happen in Italy? And I thought about it, and I wanted to be respectful, and great respect for the Italian people, and they do have good science in Italy. But I thought about it, and I said, no, I don't think so. I think this is a uniquely American story. And without calling it this virtuous circle or cycle, I talked about all the different elements that had to come together. And a treatment for Pompe disease would have been found and advanced to patients without my involvement or our family's involvement. I like to think, though, that we maybe made it move a little bit faster and with a greater sense of urgency. But I do think it's a very uniquely American story, because what we do in biotechnology is a very uniquely American business model. And it centers on the entrepreneur. You look at every great biotech company today, and they all started the same way. They started with a handful of entrepreneurs, a handful of scientists or physicians, a couple of venture capitalists willing to take a chance. And it's a remarkable business when you think about it, what it actually takes to make the technology work, let alone to make it a commercially successful entity, where almost everything we do, everything we try, in animal studies, in human clinical studies, it doesn't work. So when you think about the nature of what we do, it really does come down to the entrepreneur and all the elements around he or she in building that company. So what I'd like to talk about this morning is a little bit about this business model, because I think it is perhaps the ultimate expression of entrepreneurship, and it is a uniquely American model, and one that I think could ultimately be replicated throughout the world, and hopefully even many, many more times here in our country as we come into what I really believe is this golden age of medicine. And so I'd like to share with you some lessons learned that I've seen in my 15 years now in biotechnology, some of which I've read, some from people I've met, some from people I've worked with, and some from people I've lived with. I think they are applicable lessons in business, but I think even more importantly, they're applicable lessons and perspectives in life. And remember, in every case in biotechnology, in solving a problem, and in the last 37 years of the life of our industry, coming up with so many great medicines and knowing how far we still have to go, almost always it starts with somebody who received a diagnosis. Oftentimes where there was never any history in the family, like there wasn't with us. Pompe is a silent disease. Eileen and I were silent carriers. We'd never heard of the disease until that Friday the 13th of March 1998, when we were told that Megan, at 15 months old, and Patrick, who had just been born the week before, Megan had the disease, and Patrick had a 25% chance now that we knew his sister had it. So in biotech, it always starts with parents like us, or people, patients, living with these disorders, with these 4 words: I have a problem. And on the other side of the table, a scientist or a doctor responding with another 4 words: I have an idea. So let me share with you my first lesson that I've learned in these 15 years, and that's about vision, having that vision. So you think about, pharmaceuticals have been around a long time and have made a great impact on people's lives, But the notion of biotechnology, specifically that we can engineer living organisms to express medicines that can positively affect people's lives, as an industry is only 37 years old. And it goes back to the Bay Area in San Francisco. There was a young 29-year-old venture capitalist named Bob Swanson, and he was doing some research and reading academic papers, going to science conferences, and he learned about this whole new technology of protein expression and production, of inserting DNA into animal cells and expressing human proteins that could produce therapeutics. And he went to visit one of the leading researchers in this field, a 30-something-year-old scientist at UC San Francisco, Dr. Herb Boyer. So Swanson came in to see Boyer, and they began talking, and Boyer explained on his blackboard what he was doing. They went across the street, and they spent more time together, and literally on a couple of cocktail napkins outlined an idea for how do you take this raw science and maybe not only build a company around it, but begin by building an industry. And with that was born the notion of a company called Genentech, eventually growing to become the largest biotechnology company and certainly one of the best companies in the world today, now part of Roche in the last few years. But the very first biotech company, going public 4 years later after those venture investments. Not always an easy course for Genentech, but you look at where they are today with medicines like Avastin and others that have saved the lives of millions of people with cancer and so many other disorders. And even Bob Swanson himself, in the late 90s, died of brain cancer. Herb Boyer was interviewed after Bob Swanson had passed away and kind of reflecting on what was Genentech and how did it come together and kind of his lessons learned. And he said something I think pretty profound in that interview. He said, when Bob Swanson walked into my office that day in 1976, he changed my life, and he changed the lives of millions of people to come. They had that idea, that vision. So I think that's the first thing, and you guys have read a lot and studied a lot and worked on a lot of case projects to think about, well, what can we do that's different? And some of these ideas seem crazy, and sometimes I get confused, between vision and delusions of grandeur. I'm sure there's a fine line somewhere, but you think about, boy, we've got some really big problems to solve. So how do we go about and do it? And don't be shy in your visions. And ultimately, that's going to lead to risk-taking. Just pursuing business degrees in today's environment and taking on that type of debt, stepping out of the workforce for a couple of years, it's a measure of risk-taking. To take it back to my industry and risk-taking, it's again the nature of what we do. There is a terrific company that many of you, if you're not familiar with biotech, may not have even ever heard of, just across the river here in Summit, New Jersey, and with offices now globally, a company called Celgene, now one of the world's largest biotech companies. It was founded, again, by a handful of investors, business people, and scientists, and one of those scientists was Dr. Saul Bearer. He's one of my great mentors. He's on my board of directors. But years ago, Saul had the idea with his co-founders in the 1980s that you can actually take a medicine called thalidomide. You may have heard of this because in the 1950s and 60s, it was approved in Europe for treatment of nausea as a side effect in pregnancy. It wasn't well characterized or studied, and as babies started to be born, they were born with horrible, horrible defects and missing limbs, and it was immediately withdrawn from the market, never approved here in the United States, and in fact, that's some part of the reason why the FDA has such power today to regulate the development of medicines was from the lessons developed in this drug. It was the ultimate story in drug development of drugs that were intended to do good that ultimately did harm. But Saul had an idea. He said he had done work with others, and he was a chemist by training, that you could actually use it as a powerful cancer medicine. Nobody wanted to touch it or develop it. So they started this little company, Celgene. It took them 17 years of trying, including more than a dozen years as a public company. 3 times they couldn't meet payroll as a public company. But eventually they got the drug approved more than a decade ago. Starting with leprosy, you talk about a niche indication in medicine. From there, though, they eventually developed it for blood cancers, multiple myeloma, and others. Analoging that drug, coming up with even better, more powerful, and safer compounds. And like Genentech, a company today that has saved and improved the lives of millions of people around the world, for whom many of these cancers are no longer a death sentence. But the risk-taking involved in their doing that, when countless people told them no, and setback after setback, it's a great story. It's become one of the legends in biotechnology, but I think it's a great lesson well beyond biotechnology. And I believe Celgene now is a $50+ billion market cap, 10,000 employees, and a wonderful culture as well. Saul is now retired, quite well, and a great mentor to many others like me in the biotech industry, but also a tremendous philanthropist. So you think about the notion of what he built in that business, the ability to use business as a force for good and for change, to use it to harness all the elements of that virtuous circle that we need in drug development. I think it's a stunning example of not only vision, perhaps the ultimate in risk-taking. Biotech, too, is also about hope and optimism. You've got to be an optimist in this business or you're going to get down pretty quickly. My first day in biotech, I didn't go out. We had started the company out of some science at the University of Oklahoma, and I didn't go out to Oklahoma City. We were living in New Jersey and have always lived there. I actually went up to Boston, and I went up to the biotech industry show. We call it Bio. I think there were 15,000, 20,000 people. It was a really exciting time. It was March of 2000. The market was on a tear. Capital was flowing. Science was flourishing. And I was the CEO of a 4-person company in Oklahoma with no money. So nobody wanted to meet with me, but that was fine. I just kind of wanted to go up there and take it in and listen and learn. So at 31 years old or so, I went up to Boston and I was exposed to this whole new industry, and it was super exciting. I had spent 2 years at Bristol Myers before that, had learned about pharmaceuticals and marketing and strategy, and was able to apply a lot of my business school skills. But I didn't know a lot about entrepreneurship. I knew very little about biotechnology. So I listened and I learned, and there were a lot of great entrepreneurs who spoke. But one thing I'll never forget, that night of the convention, the first night, I went to the keynote address, and it was given by a quadriplegic. As a gentleman, he came out in a wheelchair. He was ventilator dependent. There were maybe 5,000 or 7,000 of us in the audience at the convention center up at Boston, and he came out and he looked at the whole audience and he said, biotechnology. He said, that's a great big word that for people like me just means hope. He said, it's the hope that some of you are today working on treatments for paralysis and spinal cord injuries. Or it's the hope that some of you are going to pick up that work. And then he took it back to his own life, and he said, it's the optimism I have to believe that someday I could play ball with my kids again or hold my wife's hand on the beach. So when you're sitting in the audience and you're thinking about, I'm thinking about how am I going to raise money and what am I going to do to build my business plan, and boy, I got to deal with the FDA and all these different issues in building a business, which are absolutely critical. And I had 2 little kids desperately in need, and thought I had all the patient-centered medicine perspective that you can have. And I realized in that moment just how many people are going to rely on people in that audience, the vast majority of whom were business people. Tremendous science happens in our universities. Great science continues in our companies. But at the end of the day, it's industry and business and biotechnology companies, many of which aren't more than a handful of people, that develop medicines and ultimately commercialize them and get them to people. So when I listened to him, that really struck me. And something else he said struck me too. He said it's not just hope for me and for my family. He said it's hope for people who don't even know that they need hope today. He said it's hope for that kid 6 months from now who's going to break his neck playing football, and his life and his family and his neighbors and his church and everybody involved their lives are going to change because of one moment in time. And he said, and they're going to look out and look up on the internet, work, and he looked out in the audience. He said, work that you haven't even done yet. He said, it may not, he said, I'm a realist. It may not come in time. I have this hope. I'm an optimist, but it may not come in time for me. But I know someday it'll come in time for somebody who needs that hope, who doesn't yet know they need it today. And he was right, and it was Christopher Reeve who gave that talk that night, and about 3 years later, he died from complications of his paralysis. But I never forgot that measure of hope and that notion of being an optimist, because I could tell you, business is tough. It's really tough sometimes. Those of us who have managed public companies in the last 5 years, when it seemed that capital completely dried up, when risk-taking across society, not just in business, was unheard of, and nobody wanted to take risk. It was all about risk mitigation. Well, I don't work in a business that thrives on risk mitigation. So to have that sense of hope and optimism is unbelievably important to us. But you don't always have to rely on people who may be your ultimate, for us, customers or people that we serve. The whole notion of people living with these diseases, we are amazingly patient-focused. In our meetings, in our business meetings, I always have my head of patient advocacy there. And I'll turn to her, I'll say, Jane, if you were living with Fabry disease and you were sitting at this table and you were going through this drug development plan, where we talked about how many patients and budgets and timelines and how would Wall Street react with all these different issues that we have to consider, I always ask her, what would you think? Is this something that would excite you or not? Is this innovative enough? And that's something I think in any business that we carry forward that we have to do. And when you think about some of the lessons that we learned, that we've even heard already this morning, I think it's part of our duty to make sure that we don't not take chances. We have to. We have to make sure we continue to innovate. Some of the technologies that are out there, whether it's in the IT space, in biotechnology, are absolutely blow my mind when I hear this stuff. I just learned what a 3D printer was not too long ago, and just recently somebody told me that they're using 3D printers to make human organs. How that's going to revolutionize medicine. It's also visionary. It's also risk-taking. And you got to be an optimist to believe it, because at least in medicine, most of what we're going to try isn't going to work. But when it does, it really is the best job you can have. It also comes down then, and another perspective is that notion of persistence. The talk in your program here was focused on never, never, never quit. And I think that's a theme throughout. But it's also something, it's easy to be in a good mood when things are going well, but to keep that mood when you can't raise the money, when key people just left you, when an analyst on Wall Street writes a nasty note, not only about your company or your technology, but about you. And believe me, don't ever go on the Yahoo Finance page blog spots. But you got to step back and believe in you and your team, and the notion that even if the technology in biotech that we're working on today isn't working, that something is going to work, and we've got that duty to innovate and to persist. When I started the week after I came back from Boston and did go out to our labs in Oklahoma City in late March of 2000, I had this small little office next to our founder and chief scientist. I didn't have any pictures or decorations. I had a picture of the kids and a picture of the family on one side. And I got a nice note from my mom and kind of a, good luck, and I know you need this to work, and we're hoping and praying that it does. I didn't know that it would, and I think in the back of my mind, I thought it would fail, but at least I didn't want to look out years or decades later and wished that we had done something else. So we did it. And with that letter, she put a little, it was actually a little brass bookmark from Barnes & Noble, and it was a quote from Winston Churchill, and it said very simply, Churchill's famous quote of never, never, never quit. And I kind of looked at it and kind of hit home, and I took it and I tucked it in the picture of the kids in the corner of the frame, and I still keep it on my desk today, and I can't tell you how many times in the last 15 years and many times in the last 5 years that I've had to go back and just glance at that and think, you know what? You're right. This is too important. We've got to figure it out. And so we go back and we do it again. And we have built some great companies, and we've had our measures of success and failure along the way. I'll share with you another perspective that I learned, and this is about relying on others. This notion of mutual interdependence, and I think it's absolutely critical in this whole virtuous circle of what we do in making medicines, but I think it's true more broadly in life. So by November of 2004, Megan and Patrick had been on this life-saving medicine. They take it every other week. It's an enzyme replacement therapy. For then nearly 2 years, and they were so much stronger, and we were able to do things that we had never been able to do before as a family. And we decided one thing we were going to do, I'd never done as a kid, was to go to the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. So kind of a neat, fun experience. Now, my dad was an Irish cop over the George Washington Bridge here. We went to a lot of St. Patrick's Day parades, but we'd never been to a Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. So we did. We got the vans lined up. We got a beautiful couple of hotel rooms on Central Park. We took the kids in. We had hospital beds and nurses, and we made it as seamless as possible. We went shopping. We went to see a play, and then Thursday morning we had to get up and go see the parade. It takes a while to get Megan and Patrick ready, and we got them together. We came out of the hotel. Now, I'm used to the St. Patrick's Day Parade marching up Fifth Avenue. Kind of slipped my mind that this is over a couple of avenues. So I thought, okay, well, we'll just find our piece of real estate, and the kids will get to watch the parade. Well, I turned and onto Central Park South into this sea of humanity. And I realized in that moment, for all the success we had had and being able to coordinate and orchestrate what was a great trip for the kids, one thing I'd forgotten. I'd forgotten to actually find a place to watch the parade. So I'm like, okay. So I'm thinking in my head, okay, I'm an entrepreneur, I'll solve a problem, let's just keep walking. And I walk forward, and the New York City police had carved out a middle of the street for emergency personnel, and they had their blue barricades. And I began, with my mother-in-law's help, to move one of the barricades. Well, it turns out that the New York City Police Department, New York's finest, really, really don't like it when you move their barricades. So I attracted the attention of one very large lieutenant who came over and started just berating me. And then he stopped and he looked over and he said, "Wait here, I'll be right back." And I think, oh God, what did I do now? So now I look back to Eileen and the kids, and I just kind of wink and nod, and kind of, being a dad is not much different than being a CEO. Oftentimes you just kind of act like you're in charge of something while you're figuring it out in your head. Now he comes back with 2 young police officers, and I'm thinking, all right, this is a bit of an overkill. I'm not that big of a guy to take away by any means. So he says, "Follow me." And he moves the barricade. And with the kids in their wheelchairs, a new little puppy that we had, the kids' friends, my grandmother, about 10 or 12 of us, we follow these cops forward. And for the next 10 minutes or so, they clear out a couple of city blocks so Megan and Patrick can get up to the edge of the parade. Now we get close to Columbus Circle, and there's a couple of hundred people sitting down, and God love them, they've probably been there for 2 days to get these seats. And this big lieutenant says, "I need everybody up, move." And by that point, they were going to move because Megan's wheelchair is motorized and weighs 350 pounds, and she was marching forward because Santa was about ready to come down the street. So we get to the edge, and the kids were literally on the edge of Columbus Circle. And I turned to the lieutenant and I said, "Sir, thank you." And he wasn't paying attention to me, he was just looking at the kids. And he said, kind of brushed me aside, and he moved that barricade because he realized sitting where they were in their wheelchairs, they had a partially obstructed view of the parade, and he wasn't going to have any of that. So we moved them literally onto the parade route. So now my greatest fear is not that they're going to miss the parade, it's that they actually may be run over by a float. But it was one of those magical moments, and for the success we had had in business and in life, I realized in that moment that for those past 15 minutes, it was totally out of my control. There was nothing I could do, and I had to rely on the help of others. And you think about that lieutenant and his 2 young patrolmen, the reason they did that wasn't because they were ordered to. or somebody told them to. They did it because they could and because it was right. And I looked at him, finally said, "Thank you. You made our Thanksgiving." And this great big guy, this cop, put his hand on my shoulder and he said, "No, thank you. You made my Thanksgiving. God bless." And I realized in that moment he was being quite honest. And it gets back to that notion of the circular giving and giving back. And yeah, in growing business, we've got a responsibility to maximize shareholder wealth. It's critical to the success of capitalism and free enterprise that will drive many, many more companies like mine and others. And that's not always easy. But when we do succeed, there is that obligation to give back in society. And it doesn't mean because you're super rich and you can give money away. You may give of your time, talent, or treasure. And the last lesson I'll leave you with is this, and that's the notion of time itself. We spent a lot of time with Geeta Anand when she wrote those Wall Street Journal articles, and many of you may have seen just a month ago today, she wrote a front page story about Megan and her continued journey with Pompeii and some brave decisions she made last summer to repair her scoliosis through surgery. And she's a wonderful lady, and she's got a great gift for words. And this last lesson I'll leave with you, I think certainly transcends anything we do in business, but it underlies what we need to continue to be mindful of as business leaders, as wives, as husbands, as mothers, fathers, as human beings. And Geeta wrote these words that I'll leave you with. She said, as human beings, we are defined at our cores by how we respond to hardship. Writing about the Crowleys has taught me that there is not one right way, but that each person must find her own path, drawing on her own unique strength, passion, and resources. Who can say whether John's or Eileen's role is more important? Fueled by love, each of their journeys is tough, vital, and courageous. Knowing that each day really may be their children's last, they live with abandon, throwing themselves into every birthday party, trip to Broadway, weekend in Ocean City. Knowing so intimately the tenuousness of life, they instinctively understand what most of us forget, that all they really have and all they really are pursuing is time with the people they love. And so they grab onto each precious moment, cherish it, celebrate it, laugh at it, cry in it, and hope for another, even as they continue on the journey into the unknown and the unknowable that we all call life. Good luck. God bless.